At 27, I was still figuring things out. I'd been living alone in Seattle for just over 2 years, working as an administrative assistant at a downtown office. Most days felt like they ran together. Work, home, the occasional drink with colleagues. I wasn't the type to go out much, but I liked meeting new people. That's how I met Ethan. It started innocently enough, on a typical weekday. I was grabbing coffee before work when he stood behind me in line. He smiled, struck up a conversation. It was one of those smiles, the kind that made you feel seen, like you were the only person in the room. Easygoing, confident, he felt like a breath of fresh air. We swapped numbers before I even realized it. At first, Ethan seemed like everything I'd been missing. Tall, with a smile that disarmed me, he texted me every day without fail. How was my day? Funny memes. Suggestions for new spots to check out around Seattle. It was sweet at first, even flattering. I hadn't had someone show that kind of interest in a while. But looking back, it feels like he was playing a role. Perfectly, carefully. Like he knew exactly what to say to get me to let my guard down. A few weeks later, we started dating. His efforts were relentless, always making things feel special. Our first date, a cozy, dimly lit restaurant with soft live music. He opened the car door for me, paid without hesitation, kissed my forehead as he said goodnight, telling me he couldn't wait to see me again. It felt so different from anything I'd experienced. So attentive, so thoughtful. I thought I'd found someone incredible, but even then, something felt off. He was intense, but I chalked it up to passion. When I didn't respond to a message right away, he'd check in, asking if everything was okay. He sent flowers to my office just because. I thought it was cute, maybe a little over the top, but sweet. But then it escalated. One Saturday, I mentioned in passing that I had plans. The next thing I knew, he was at my door, saying he couldn't stand being away from me. I laughed awkwardly, but let it slide. Who wouldn't want someone who was so invested, right? The first time I truly felt uneasy was a Sunday. Ethan had been asking me to come over for dinner at his house for weeks. I finally agreed. His place was in a quiet neighborhood with long streets and tall trees that made it feel isolated. Inside, it was immaculate, too perfect, like someone had taken the time to arrange every detail just so. I noticed the tension in him as soon as I touched anything, even the smallest object. At dinner, his eyes never left me. It wasn't the affectionate kind of gaze. No, it was like he was studying me, measuring me. It made my skin crawl, but I ignored it. Maybe he was just different, I told myself. Things got worse when he insisted I try a wine he'd open. I'm not much of a drinker, but I took a glass anyway. It didn't take long before I started feeling heavy, sluggish, like something was seeping into my body, making my mind foggy. My vision blurred, and I didn't even have time to understand what was happening before everything went black. When I woke up, my body felt stiff. The air smelled damp and stale. Panic surged through me. I was in a dark room, my wrists bound to a chair. My heart pounded as I fought to comprehend what was happening. Ethan was sitting in front of me, smiling. But the smile was wrong now. Not friendly at all. It was cold, unsettling. It didn't reach his eyes. He spoke to me in that calm, almost gentle voice, like this was all normal. "You need to learn to trust me," he said, eyes fixed on mine, his voice a soft lullaby that made my blood run cold. The outside world is too dangerous for someone like you. Every word he spoke twisted the air around me tighter. He wasn't just talking about us. He was talking about something bigger. He believed it. Believed he was protecting me, that no one else could. My head throbbed, and the musty smell in the room made everything feel more suffocating. I fought to steady my breath, tried to keep my mind focused. Panicking would only make things worse. I had to stay calm. But even as I told myself that, I realized, with chilling clarity, if I didn't find a way out, no one was coming for me. I looked around, desperately trying to take in any details of the room that might help me. The walls were bare, white and cold, except for a shelf full of books. Stacks of boxes were haphazardly piled up in the corner. It wasn't a random place. It was planned. I was planned. My hands were tied tightly with something rough and unyielding. Probably tape, thick nylon tape. Ethan noticed me looking around, and the calmness slipped away. He stood up suddenly, an almost imperceptible shift in his posture, like a predator reaffirming its control. "You don't need to worry about anything. I'll take care of you," he said, so matter-of-factly that it made everything feel even more insane. I realized then that if I didn't get out on my own, I never would. I knew time wasn't on my side. I had to think quickly, but my mind was racing, and every thought felt like it was moving through molasses. Ethan's obsession with control was the only thing I could use. I forced myself to breathe, pretending a calm I didn't feel. I mustered a weak smile, the kind you show when you're trying not to cry. "You're right," I said, my voice more shaky than I wanted. "I just need some time to process all of this." He stared at me, studying me, his eyes searching for any crack in my facade. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift. Like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe me. "I knew you would understand," he replied, his voice smooth and cold, that same sickly calm tone. Inside, my heart was beating so loud I thought it would break through my chest. The sound felt like it was echoing in my ears, a ticking clock I could never stop. When he left the room, the silence was deafening. And that's when I saw it. A screwdriver, half hidden in one of the boxes near my chair. It was like he'd forgotten it in his rush to set up the space, too confident that I wouldn't be a threat. The idea of escaping suddenly felt real, but the clock was ticking. I waited. I had to wait. I couldn't risk him hearing me move. My wrist burned with the effort, the nylon tape digging into my skin, but I kept pushing, straining against the restraints. The minutes stretched on, each one like an eternity. Finally, I felt the cold metal of the screwdriver in my fingers. My hand shook uncontrollably as I gripped it, but I didn't dare stop. With the sharp pain of the tape cutting into my skin, I worked furiously, trying to free myself. The pressure on my wrists made every movement excruciating, but I knew that if I didn't get free, this could be my last chance. The pain was unbearable, but when I finally felt my hand slip free, the relief was sharp, a jolt of hope in a world that had been nothing but terror. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, trying not to make a sound. The room was quiet, but the silence was thick with the knowledge that Ethan was close, maybe just beyond the door. Unaware that I'd freed myself, I glanced around. I needed something. Anything. I found a box in the corner, its flaps open, and inside a few tools and a small flashlight. I grabbed it, its weight comforting in my hand, solid enough to swing if I had to. The door was my only way out. I could hear his voice from the other room, muttering to himself in that strange, incoherent way. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to focus. Every sound seemed to rattle the walls. His voice was softer now, but the words he muttered made my stomach churn. She will understand. She will thank me someday. His voice was a warped lullaby, and with every word, the air around me felt thicker. I tried to breathe, tried to steady myself, but it was hard. The front door was just a few steps away, and I was so close, and the floor creaked under my foot. A small sound, but it was enough. I heard his voice stop mid-sentence, the silence stretching long and heavy. I froze, panic clawing at my throat. The next few seconds felt like they lasted an eternity, and then, in a split second, I ran. My heart thundered in my chest as I rushed toward the door. I twisted the handle, but it was locked. My stomach dropped, and I turned to see him, standing in the hallway, his expression a terrifying mix of anger and something worse. Pleasure. I knew you would try that, he said, his voice almost gleeful as he walked toward me. Desperation surged through me. I swung the flashlight with everything I had. The blow landed hard, and Ethan screamed, crumpling to the floor with a sickening thud. I didn't hesitate. I didn't give him time to recover. My hands were still shaking violently, but I knew I couldn't afford to waste a second. I searched his pockets, hands fumbling, until I found the key. I ran for the door, unlocking it in frantic, clumsy movements, and then, finally, it opened. The cold night air hit me like a slap of reality. I didn't think. I just ran. I screamed, my voice hoarse, my legs barely holding me up as I bolted down the street. The houses around me were dark, the street eerily quiet, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance between me and Ethan as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights. A car was coming, and I didn't hesitate. I jumped in front of it, the driver slamming on the brakes, screeching to a stop. He got out, wide-eyed and frightened, but I barely registered his fear. I screamed at him, explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He called the police. By the time they arrived, I was shaking, barely able to stand. I told them everything I could remember. We went back to Ethan's house, but he was gone. Inside, they found evidence that I wasn't the first person he'd held captive. To this day, he hasn't been found. And I still wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes, hearing his voice in the distance, a twisted echo that won't fade. My name is Emily. I live in a quiet town on the East Coast, and I work as a nurse at the local hospital. After years of pouring myself into my job, I realized I needed to step back and connect with people again. That's when I made a Tinder profile. I didn't expect much, just some casual conversations, but then Alex's profile popped up. He had a smile that seemed to promise warmth, and we shared interests in music and photography. Our conversations were effortless. He knew exactly how to make me laugh. At first, it felt refreshing. Our first date was at a cozy little cafe near the Central Park. Alex was even more charming in person, a kind of magnetic presence that drew me in. He hung on every word I said, genuinely curious, always asking questions. He was intense, but in a way that felt flattering at first. He was interested, right? But then there were the small things. The way he'd text me nonstop. How he'd expect me to reply immediately. If I didn't, the messages became more urgent, a little demanding. I tried to brush it off, assuming it was just excitement. But soon, it felt wrong. It started slowly. He'd show up in places I frequented, places I hadn't mentioned to him. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but it happened too often. One night, I went to a small bar after a long shift, and there he was, sitting at the counter like he'd been waiting for me. I smiled awkwardly and waved, but my stomach turned as I realized I couldn't shake the feeling he was watching me, studying me. That was the first time I felt stalked. Soon, it escalated. He started commenting on things I hadn't told him about. Places I'd been. Things I'd done. How did he know these things? I felt like I was losing control over my own life. When I finally told him I needed some space, that things were moving too quickly for me, he didn't take it well. The flood of calls, texts. It was like nothing I'd said mattered. The worst ones were the ones where his anger slipped through. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. That's when I knew I had to get out. I blocked him on everything, but the messages didn't stop. They came from unknown numbers, relentless. I need to see you, he'd say. I can't live without you. I felt the walls closing in. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, I stepped outside and found one of my tires flat. I bent down to check it, my fingers shaking. The sharp sound of footsteps approached, too heavy, too deliberate. When I looked up, there he was, Alex. Out of nowhere, like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. He smiled at me, his eyes cold, but the kind of cold that made my skin prickle. "Let me help," he said, his voice too soft, too insistent. I stepped back, a chill crawling up my spine. "No, thank you," I managed to say, turning to call a taxi, my heart racing. I could feel his eyes on me as the car pulled away, an oppressive weight pressing against my chest. But the worst was yet to come. On a Saturday morning, I decided to take a break and drive to my parents' house a few hours away. I needed distance to clear my mind. But somewhere along the way, I began to feel like I was being followed. A car behind me, just a little too close, always at my tail. I tried to shake the feeling off. Paranoia, right? But then, a car cut in front of me, slamming on the brakes and forcing me to stop on the shoulder. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, Alex was at my window. His eyes were wide, too wide, and that smile, the one that had once been charming, now felt sickening. "I knew I'd find you," he said, and the air in my lungs froze. He yanked the door open, too quickly, too forcefully. My mind went blank, a haze descending over me as I struggled to breathe. His words rang in my ears, muffled but clear. "We'll be together forever now." The next thing I remember, I woke up in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were aged wood, the air thick with mildew. A single window showed only a sea of trees outside. I rubbed my wrists. They were free, but the door, locked. I tried to stay calm, but my pulse pounded so loudly in my ears, I thought it might drown me. Just as I started to think I'd lost my mind, Alex walked in. He was carrying a tray with food, his expression serene, as though nothing had happened, as if this was normal. "We finally have time for ourselves," he said, setting the tray down. His smile was soft, too soft. He spoke with an air of certainty, as though he believed this was what I wanted too. "You'll understand in time," he murmured, his voice laced with something darker, something final. I couldn't breathe. In the days that followed, I studied every detail of that place. I had no choice. It was the only way to figure out how to escape. The cabin was isolated, no neighbors, no signs of life for miles. Surrounded by thick, unwelcoming forest, Alex would leave regularly, presumably to fetch supplies. But whenever he did, he'd lock all the doors and windows with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. He wanted to make sure I didn't leave. But one day, while I was trying to keep up appearances, I noticed something. A small, rusted latch on the bathroom window. It was old, barely functional, but it might be my only chance. I pretended to cooperate. I smiled when I had to, nodded when he spoke. I listened, asking the right questions, feigning interest in the stories he told me. Anything to make him lower his guard. He trusted me, or at least I told myself that. Every moment felt like a calculated risk, but it was my only shot at freedom. When he left that morning, I knew this was it. My heart hammered in my chest as I heard the door click shut behind him. I waited, listening to the silence of the cabin as I crept to the bathroom. The window opened with a slow, grinding protest, the rust scraping against the frame. The space was tight, too tight, but I forced myself through, gritting my teeth to hold back the panic that clawed at my throat. The outside air was cool, the forest dark and dense, but I had no time to think. I fell to the ground, my body hitting the dirt harder than I expected, but I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my knee. The trees towered around me like silent witnesses, but I didn't dare stop to look. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, keep running. I sprinted through the underbrush, my clothes catching on branches, my skin scraping against the rough bark. Each step was a fight to keep going. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't just running. I was fleeing from something worse than any injury or fatigue. I was running for my life. I heard his voice before I saw him. "Emily." It was distant, but unmistakable. His voice had shifted, desperation creeping into his tone. The sound of his name twisted my insides. I couldn't let him catch me. The thought of him getting close again made me run faster, pushing myself beyond what I thought my body could handle. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees into a small clearing. I looked up, and there it was, a road, asphalt stretching before me, a road that could lead to freedom. Without thinking, I ran toward it, my legs aching, every muscle screaming in protest. I didn't dare look back. I was too scared that if I did, I'd see him coming for me. A car appeared on the horizon, moving too fast to be a coincidence. I didn't hesitate. I waved frantically, my arms shaking. The car skidded to a stop, the door opening before I even reached it. A couple. They didn't ask questions. They just helped me in, their eyes wide with concern. I couldn't speak at first. I was gasping for air, my heart still racing in my chest. I grabbed the phone from my pocket and dialed the police, my fingers fumbling as I gave them a shaky, frantic description of where I'd been. It didn't take long. A few hours later, they found the cabin. They found him. Alex was arrested without a fight, his calm demeanor now replaced by confusion. He didn't understand what was wrong. I didn't stick around long enough to hear the rest. The hardest part was coming home. The world felt unreal. It wasn't just the fear. It was the sense that everything had changed, that I'd never be the same. I spent days second-guessing everything. The decisions I made, the way I'd trusted him. The relief of being safe didn't last long. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it all. I want to share this experience, as a warning. Trust your instincts. Don't ignore that little voice that tells you something's wrong. You never think something like this could happen to you, but it can. It did. And now, I'll never be the same, but I'm alive. And maybe that's enough. Usually, my evenings were filled with the predictable comfort of binge-watching shows or revisiting forgotten books. But on that Tuesday, something felt different. The streets were already wearing the crispness of autumn, the sidewalks blanketed in orange leaves, and the cool air seemed to beckon me outside. I decided, on a whim, to visit Sasha, someone I hadn't seen in what felt like ages. We'd met in college, and she always had a way of making everything seem lighter, her sharp wit and contagious laugh making even the mundane feel meaningful. It had been a while since we'd stayed up late chatting, and I thought maybe tonight would be different. I grabbed a bottle of wine, ready to dive into the comfort of our familiar conversations. I arrived at her house just after 7. The sky already dipped in deep blue with shy stars beginning to appear. Sasha's house was unmistakable. A turquoise door, a front garden overrun with sunflowers that seemed determined to resist the change of seasons. I rang the doorbell and was met by her smile, the kind that lit up her whole face. We settled in the living room, surrounded by colorful pillows, soft music playing in the background. The conversation flowed easily. Work, family, future plans, until the passage of time became irrelevant. It was the kind of evening that felt like it could last forever. The warmth of her presence like a protective cocoon. Then the doorbell rang. The sudden sound shattered the calm like a glass breaking, its sharpness jarring in the otherwise peaceful air. Sasha looked toward the door, her brow furrowing. "I'm not expecting anyone," she said under her breath, clearly caught off guard. She stood, leaving me in the living room as she made her way to the door. I stayed where I was, my curiosity prickling as muffled voices drifted down the hallway. There was a strange cadence to their whispers. A man's voice, low and persistent, and Sasha's tone, hesitant, maybe even strained. My stomach knotted. Something wasn't right. I crept closer, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Peering around the corner, I caught sight of the man, a tall figure with restless eyes, his smile too wide, like it didn't quite fit. He held a bouquet of wilting flowers in his hand, the edges of the petals brown and curling. "Sasha, we need to talk," he insisted, his voice thick with a forced calm. Sasha's body blocked the doorway, but she didn't shut it. "I told you," she said, her voice quieter now, her words sharp but uncertain. "It's not a good time." The unease in my chest blossomed into something darker. My instinct told me to stay back, not to make myself known, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an awkward visit. I turned and went back to the living room, trying to calm the growing sense of dread. The warmth that had filled the room moments ago now felt suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards above sounded louder than it should. Then, Sasha raised her voice, her words sharp and cutting through the quiet. I told you to leave. It's not a good time. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't want to stay and make things worse, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off. I glanced toward the back door, remembering that Sasha's garden led to an alley behind the house, a route that would take me out unnoticed. I grabbed my coat, hands shaking, and stepped toward the back door. The backyard was bathed in the pale light of the moon, casting long, twisted shadows. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. I scaled the low fence that separated Sasha's yard from the neighbors, but the moment my feet hit the ground, I froze. A massive mastiff stood just a few feet away, its eyes glowing in the darkness, fixed on me with a predatory stillness. My heart stopped, my body frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The dog's low growl vibrated through my chest, and the chill that ran down my spine felt like ice. I reached for a branch on the ground, tossing it far off into the shadows. The dog's attention shifted, its growl turning into an anxious whine as it moved toward the noise. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted for the next fence, my pulse thundering in my ears. As I climbed over the second fence, I felt the sharp tug of a loose nail catching on my pants. With a sickening tear, the fabric split, leaving me with torn clothes and a sense of absurdity. My mind screamed that this had to be a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. I crossed the lawn, careful to avoid the scattered toys left behind. An abandoned red tricycle, a soccer ball deflated in the grass. The lights in the house were off, but even in the quiet darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I reached the next fence, I heard it. Low voices, muffled laughter, the crackling of something burning. I hesitated, pressing myself flat against the cool wood, trying to make myself as small as possible. I peered through a narrow gap, just enough to see. Two teenagers, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of an improvised bonfire, sat huddled together, roasting marshmallows and chatting in that carefree way only teenagers can. There was no way to pass unnoticed. Not with the fire so close, its warmth and light spilling out into the yard. I felt the familiar panic start to rise in my chest. I ducked behind a bush, the damp earth beneath me cold and unwelcoming. Time dragged like thick tar, each second stretching longer than the last. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear the quiet rustling of the leaves around me, as if the entire night had become an audience to my nerves. What the hell am I doing? I muttered under my breath, trying to laugh at myself, but the sound came out hollow, almost unnatural. I'd gone from a casual visit to this strange, creeping unease, all because I'd thought I could show up unannounced. After what felt like an eternity, the teenagers finally put out the fire and stumbled toward the house, still laughing, still loud. But the moment they disappeared into the darkened interior of the house, the silence returned. I didn't waste a second. I crept out from behind the bush, my legs stiff with fear and uncertainty, and continued my slow, deliberate march. The lawn was damp now, and with every step, my shoes sank into the wet grass, a soft, sucking sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive stillness. The next fence loomed ahead, taller, with weathered wooden planks that seemed to sag with age. I took a breath, steadying myself, and began to climb. The rough edges of the woods scraped at my hands, sending sharp, biting pain through my fingers, but I pushed on, desperate to get out of there. Just as I neared the top, I heard it. Slam. The loud crack of a trash can lid being thrown shut. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Over my shoulder, I saw him. An old man, his face like a mask of stone, his eyes cold and fixed on me. He was standing just inside the yard, the light from the house casting long shadows across his features. His voice was thick with irritation. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" His words cut through the night. Too loud, too sharp. Panic surged through me, raw and immediate. Without thinking, I threw myself over the top of the fence, my body crashing down on the other side. Pain shot up my leg as I landed wrong. My ankle twisted beneath me, sending a wave of agony that almost made me cry out. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I limped as fast as I could, the sharp ache in my ankle only adding to the fear pounding in my chest. The man's footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, echoing in the darkness. My heart raced so fast I thought it might explode. Every step felt like it could be my last. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, faster, harder, until I finally saw it. The flicker of streetlights ahead. The city. People. Safety. I stumbled into the flow of people walking along the sidewalk, trying to blend in, to disappear. My breath came in ragged bursts, my legs shaking with exhaustion and panic. I glanced back, my heart in my throat, and saw the old man stop at the alley entrance. He didn't come any closer, just stood there, his gaze locked on me, suspicious, unyielding. Ankle throbbed, each step a painful reminder of how close I'd come to something worse. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I flagged down the first taxi I saw, barely able to focus through the haze of adrenaline and pain. I slid into the back seat, my hands shaking as I tried to calm my breath. As the driver asked for my destination, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sasha. "Where are you? We need to talk." A wave of guilt crashed over me. I knew somehow that I'd left her in a bad spot. I quickly typed back, explaining the situation with the man at her door. She replied almost immediately, her message sharp, urgent. "That guy wasn't a Tinder date. He's been stalking me for weeks. When you left, things got worse. He tried to force his way in, but I called the cops, and he ran. I'm scared." My stomach dropped. I should have stayed. I could have done something. But now, it was too late. Without thinking, I turned to the driver. "Take me back to Sasha's house," I said, my voice tight, almost frantic. The streetlights flickered as we made our way back. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. When we finally arrived, the house lights were still on, but the street was unnervingly quiet. I paid the driver, my thoughts racing, and limped out, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. I knocked urgently on the door, my hand trembling as I waited. It creaked open, almost immediately. Sasha stood in the doorway, pale and shaken, her eyes bloodshot from crying. "Has he come back?" I gasped, breathless. Sasha didn't answer. She just shook her head. But the fear in her eyes said everything. And for the first time that night, I realized just how badly I had misjudged the situation. We locked every door, checked every window, and settled on the couch, the air thick with silence. Sasha began telling me everything. How the man wasn't a Tinder date at all, but someone she had met casually at a cafe weeks ago. She had thought it was harmless at first, but then he kept showing up at places she frequented, sending cryptic messages, and showing up uninvited. I thought it was just a phase. I thought he'd stop, she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, like the words themselves were afraid to be spoken. Suddenly, we both heard it. A noise from the kitchen window, a clatter, something knocked over. Our eyes locked, and an icy chill ran down my spine. You locked all the windows, didn't you? I asked, my voice strained as if I already knew the answer. My heart began to race, my thoughts spiraling. With my breath caught in my throat, I stood slowly, each movement measured, trying to make no sound. Sasha gripped my arm so tightly I almost winced, her eyes wide, fixed on the kitchen door. "Stay here," I whispered. Though my voice trembled more than I cared to admit, I walked toward the kitchen, my feet feeling like they were dragging through tar. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the living room. When I reached the kitchen entrance, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The window was ajar, the curtain gently swaying in the night's cool breeze. A plant pot lay on the floor, its contents spilled in a dark, uneven streak across the white tile, like a bruise on the floor. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. It moved quickly, darting into the darkness of the hallway. I whipped around, my heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just the overwhelming blackness pressing in on me. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice cracking more than I intended. No response. The darkness swallowed the question whole. I rushed back to the living room, my breath shallow and fast, and barely had time to speak before we heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, each thud of his boots shaking the quiet like a drumbeat. "He's in the house." Sasha's voice trembled. "He's upstairs." Panic surged through me, and for a brief moment, I couldn't think. I fumbled for my phone, but then I remembered. I'd left it in the taxi in my haste to get back. Desperation clawed at me. "Do you still have that old cell phone?" I whispered urgently. Sasha nodded, her hands trembling as she scrambled for a drawer, shuffling through cords and forgotten objects. She pulled out a cracked smartphone, its screen shattered but functional. As she dialed the police, I heard the footsteps above us, getting closer, heavier, descending the stairs. The creaking of the steps was louder now, each one like a countdown. I scanned the room, my eyes locking on a heavy candlestick on the coffee table. It was all I had. My hands shook as I grabbed it, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I motioned for Sasha to hide behind the sofa. She nodded, her fear palpable, and curled herself into a ball out of sight. I tried to steady my breath, trying to quiet the noise in my head. Then his silhouette appeared. He lingered at the top of the stairs, cloaked in shadows, but his eyes, those eyes, they gleamed in the dim light like something from a nightmare. His voice was calm, too calm. "Why are you making this difficult?" he asked, almost like he was speaking to a child. "I just want to talk, Sasha." My palm was slick around the candlestick, but I held it firm. "Leave. Now the police will be here any moment," I shouted, though my voice felt small, barely above a whisper. Sasha was still speaking on the phone behind me, trying to explain the situation, her words rushing in a desperate whisper. The man took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. He was like a predator, circling, calculating. I didn't know how much longer I could hold my ground. Then The sirens. They cut through the air, growing louder, closer. The man's face faltered for a second, and I saw it. Fear. The confidence evaporated, and he took a small, cautious step back. That's when it happened. A loud bang on the door, followed by authoritative voices. "Police! Open up!" Man's eyes darted around, searching, but there was nowhere left to hide. Before he could make any move, the door crashed open. 2 officers stormed in, guns raised. "Hands on your head!" they shouted. He froze. Slowly, his hands lifted in surrender, his defeat written across his face. Sasha exhaled a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. I lowered the candlestick, my legs suddenly weak beneath me, as if the tension had been holding me up all along. The officers took the man into custody after we gave our statements, ensuring that Sasha was safe. When they left, I finally sank into the couch beside her, emotionally drained, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion. "I'm sorry I left earlier," I said, the weight of guilt pressing down on me. She squeezed my hand, offering me a faint, shaky smile. I couldn't imagine this happening. The important thing is, we're safe now. From that night forward, Sasha sought legal and psychological help, taking steps to reclaim her peace of mind. Our bond grew stronger, and we began to appreciate the quiet moments in a new way. Now, when I remember that night, the chill still creeps down my spine. But I also feel a deep sense of relief. I learned that danger doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes our strength only reveals itself when we're pushed to the brink. Above all, I realize the irreplaceable value of being there for the people who matter, even when the world seems to spiral out of control. Life isn't always kind, but it's in the hardest moments that we learn what we're truly capable of. Everything started about 2 years ago when I, Samantha, a 28-year-old woman, was working as an administrative assistant at a small company downtown. People had always described me as gentle, maybe too gentle at times. Always a little unsure of myself, too easily swayed by the thoughts and opinions of others. I lived alone in a cozy apartment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of plants and well-worn books, a place that spoke to my love for classic literature. Life was calm, routine, but something was missing. I couldn't pinpoint it then, but now I know. I was craving a connection, something real that would fill the hollow spaces I hadn't even realized existed. It was at a coworker's birthday party where I first met Niall. He stood out immediately, not just because of his striking smile, but because of the kind of attention he commanded without even trying. The navy blue suit he wore fit him perfectly, as though he'd stepped out of a dream. And his eyes, those eyes, seemed to look right through me, as if he knew all my hidden thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was warm and deliberate, the kind that made you feel safe, like you could finally exhale. It was easy to talk to him, effortless, like I could tell him everything, the things I kept locked up inside. I thought, for the first time in a long while, that maybe I'd found the connection I'd been yearning for, and for a while, it was perfect. As weeks passed, our relationship grew deeper. Niall always knew what to say, how to make me feel seen, understood, special. Our nights were filled with endless conversations about the future, about traveling, about dreams that somehow seemed more attainable when we spoke of them together. He had this way of turning the mundane into something memorable, like that dinner on my apartment balcony under the stars, where he'd brought candles that smelled like lavender and a bottle of wine I'd never tasted. It was beautiful, and for a moment, I believed I had found everything I'd been missing. But then the cracks began to show. Quietly, at first. Niall started making little comments, things I initially brushed off. Maybe you should rearrange your bookshelf. It looks a bit cluttered. Or, that dress isn't quite right for you, don't you think? His words seemed harmless at first, even thoughtful. But with time, I began to notice the subtle, sharp edge beneath them. Criticism wrapped in the guise of concern, disguised as care. I found myself second-guessing my choices, questioning whether I had made a mistake in the way I'd arranged my life, in the way I existed. It wasn't until one night that everything snapped into focus. After a trivial argument about a dinner I'd hosted, a dinner that, in hindsight, had never mattered to him, Niall lost control. He hurled a sharp object across the room, and it struck the small statuette my grandmother had given me, the one I'd always kept in the living room. I froze, watching it shatter on the floor, the pieces like fragments of something precious being erased. His anger felt unnatural, excessive, like a storm ripping through everything in its path. My hands trembled, my breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I felt afraid. As the days turned to weeks, Niall's behavior became more erratic. His need to know where I was, who I was with, became all-consuming. At first, I chalked it up to him caring for me, wanting to protect me. But that care began to feel like a cage. He'd ask about every detail, how long I'd been out, who I'd talked to, why I hadn't answered his texts immediately. He started following my social media, making comments on my posts, comments that felt like silent accusations. His presence loomed over me even when he wasn't around, like an unseen eye judging everything I did. I grew paranoid, unsettled. The smallest things, my own reflection in the mirror, the sound of my phone buzzing, set me on edge. And then came the isolation. At first, it was subtle, a comment here and there about my friends. "I don't think they have your best interests at heart," he'd say, his voice dripping with concern. But soon, it turned into something darker. He would question why I spent time with them, suggesting that they didn't understand me like he did. One night, I was talking to a close friend on the phone when Niall came home early, his steps heavy on the floor as he entered the apartment. He heard my voice and snapped, the fury in his eyes unlike anything I had ever seen. He demanded to know why I was talking to her, his words a mixture of accusation and rage. "What are you hiding?" he shouted. The feeling of betrayal hung in the air like smoke. From that moment, the atmosphere in our home shifted. The lightness was gone, replaced by a constant tension, a crawling dread. I was always on edge, never knowing when he'd explode, when I'd be the target of his fury. Each day, I felt a little smaller, a little more lost. I began to question everything, my choices, my friends, my worth. I had traded the life I'd once known for something that felt suffocating. Each day, I was waiting for the next eruption, and when it came, it was never anything I could predict, but always something that left me broken a little more each time. The following weeks felt like a suffocating nightmare. Niall's darker side emerged gradually, but each shift felt like a deeper descent into something that left me feeling hollow and powerless. He began to control every little aspect of my life. What I ate, when I slept, even whom I could talk to. When I planned something as simple as lunch with coworkers, he would show up out of nowhere, his eyes dark with suspicion, his words sharp and cutting. "Aren't you loyal to me?" he would ask, each syllable a blade that sliced through my self-esteem, leaving me questioning everything. The more I tried to hold on to what little autonomy I had left, the tighter his grip became. I was a prisoner in my own life, wrapped in a web of manipulation so delicate, yet so strong, that every movement only tightened the strands. One night, after a particularly cruel argument about my lack of ambition, Niall snapped. I had seen him angry before, but this was different. His fury felt like a storm breaking through the calm, unnatural, unrestrained. He grabbed a vase I'd received from a friend, a gift meant to symbolize our shared history, and slammed it against the floor. The sound of breaking ceramic was deafening, followed by the sickening softness of scattered petals as they fell around us, a cruel reminder of everything we once shared. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing, trying to make sense of how the man I loved could act so violently, and then it hit me, like a gut punch. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was scared. I was terrified of him. That night, I reached out to Laura. She was the only one I trusted, the only person who had never let me down. Her curly hair and bright smile had always been a comfort, and that night, her presence felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. She came over immediately, her face serious, but her eyes full of understanding. As we sat on the floor, surrounded by the broken remnants of what should have been a symbol of friendship, I poured my heart out. Every word felt like it tore a piece of my soul open. Every manipulation, every cutting comment, every moment where I had questioned my own worth. Laura listened without interrupting, only offering quiet words of support, assuring me that I wasn't alone, that I could fight this. In the days that followed, Laura helped me plan my escape, meticulously, carefully, as if every move we made could be the one that triggered his wrath. Together, we researched domestic violence resources, the legal steps I needed to take. I would sit there, hands shaking, as she navigated websites and printed forms, all the while my stomach churning with fear. Niall's behavior grew more unpredictable, each day bringing a new outburst, a new threat. One night, when I was at work, he broke into my apartment. The door was forced open with alarming strength, and I could feel the cold, suffocating terror as I imagined him standing there, eyes burning with rage, demanding to know where I was, who I was with. His words cut through the air like a knife, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. I had to escape. The next morning, I woke up with my heart still racing, the image of Niall breaking into my apartment, playing on an endless loop in my mind. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't shake, like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality. With Laura by my side, I started preparing for the hardest decision of my life. I packed a bag, clothes, important documents, a few mementos that I couldn't bear to leave behind. Every item I packed felt like a reminder of everything I was leaving behind, everything I had lost. The air in my apartment was thick with tension, and every sound, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window made me flinch. I was terrified, but I knew I had no choice. That afternoon, I met with a lawyer. His office was small, gray, impersonal. The kind of place where people go when their lives have been broken, when their safety has been taken away. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with calm eyes, listened to my story with quiet empathy, explaining the legal steps I would need to take to protect myself. When he spoke, I could feel a glimmer of hope, a tiny light in the darkness. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone. That night, Laura and I made our plan. I would leave. I would walk away from the apartment and from Niall's suffocating grasp. As the evening wore on, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief mixed with a deep, gnawing fear. Even with the restraining order, I knew Niall might still find a way to torment me, might still try to track me down. Laura and I talked long into the night, making decisions about what came next. Moving to a new city seemed like the only option, a place where no one knew me, where Niall couldn't find me. We researched small towns in the countryside, where we could rebuild our lives in peace. The idea of leaving everything I knew was terrifying, but the thought of starting over, free from his control, was the only thing that kept me going. The days that followed were a blur. Packing, selling furniture, finalizing everything. Every box I packed felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming my life. When the day finally came, I felt as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. With Laura by my side, holding my hand and offering quiet reassurance, we drove to the new town. The changing scenery outside the car window seemed to mirror my inner transformation, slow but steady. As we arrived at our new home at dusk, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. The road ahead would be challenging, but I knew this was my chance to rebuild. I was no longer a prisoner. I was free. I've always been someone who thrives on spontaneous adventures, and it was exactly that impulse that led me to Las Vegas in the summer of 2023. Quitting a soul-draining job felt like shedding a second skin, and I deserved a getaway to reclaim my sense of self. This trip was meant to be different. No rigid plans, just me, my suitcase, and the promise of unforgettable nights in the city that never sleeps. Las Vegas, with its neon glow and endless possibilities, seemed the perfect backdrop to rediscover my freedom. On my first night, after settling into my hotel room with a view of the Strip's pulsating lights, I felt an odd mix of excitement and loneliness. In a bid to break the solitude, I created a Tinder profile, hoping to meet someone intriguing. After a few casual chats, one man's profile stood out. Elegant photos shrouded in mystery, his description hinting at depths untold. There was something almost magnetic about him, a promise of something beyond the ordinary. Without hesitation, we arranged to meet at one of the most renowned casinos in the city. The next morning, Las Vegas buzzed with its usual vibrant energy, the sunlight casting harsh shadows through my room's windows. Deciding it was time to meet the enigmatic stranger, I chose a casual yet refined outfit, wanting to feel comfortable yet presentable. Walking to the casino, my heart raced with a mix of anticipation and a flicker of apprehension. The entrance was a cacophony of flashing lights and the relentless clamor of slot machines, an intoxicating symphony that thrummed with potential. When I finally saw him, He leaned casually against the bar, his leather jacket accentuating his broad shoulders. His smile was enigmatic, and his eyes held a spark that seemed almost otherworldly. As I approached, subtle details caught my attention. His eyes glinted with a hypnotic intensity, and his laugh had a peculiar resonance that seemed to linger in the air. For a fleeting moment, everything else faded, and our conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we were old friends reunited. But beneath his charming exterior, something felt off. As the night wore on, he began to drink more heavily, his laughter morphing into a strained, almost brittle sound. His stories, once captivating, took on a darker edge, and his gestures grew increasingly erratic. I tried to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine, suggesting we move to a quieter spot, but he resisted, his insistence adding to the growing tension. The vibrant atmosphere of the casino, initially exhilarating, now felt oppressive, the lights too bright and the sounds too loud. Determined to regain control, I proposed a game of poker, hoping it might diffuse the rising strain. He agreed reluctantly, and we took our seats at a table bathed in the harsh glare of overhead lights. At first, the game was lively, the chips clinking with each bet, our competitive banter light-hearted. But as hours slipped by, his frustration became palpable. Every lost hand seemed to erode his patience, his questions sharp and his demeanor increasingly hostile. Small disagreements escalated quickly, his once endless patience snapping with minor mistakes. The air around us thickened with unspoken tension, the playful energy dissolving into something much darker. I could feel my stomach tightening, a knot of anxiety forming as the night unraveled into an atmosphere heavy with unease. What had begun as a quest for freedom and excitement was now spiraling into an experience that left me questioning the very fabric of reality around me. As the night deepened, an uneasy tension settled between us, thickening the air around us like a heavy fog. He began to raise his voice, each word sharper than the last, drawing curious glances from other players and casino patrons. I felt a chill despite the warm Las Vegas air, my skin prickling with an unspoken dread. Trying to maintain composure, I suggested we move to a more secluded lounge, hoping a change of scenery might diffuse the growing strain. But he refused, his eyes darkening with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to prove I'm still in control," he muttered, his voice tinged with desperation. His heavy breathing grew louder, almost labored, and his wide eyes darted around the room with a wildness that unnerved me. The bright lights and incessant sounds of slot machines seemed to close in, transforming the vibrant casino into an oppressive cage. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering in the corners of my vision, making me question if they were real or figments of my escalating anxiety. Suddenly, a burly security guard approached, his presence authoritative and unyielding. "Sir, please, we need you to leave," he said, his voice firm yet measured. My heart pounded as the guard explained that my companion's aggressive behavior was disturbing other patrons. I reached out, trying to intervene, pleading for a second chance to calm things down, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The security guard didn't hesitate. With a decisive gesture, he began guiding him toward the exit. He resisted, each step he took more erratic, his muttered threats slicing through the noise of the casino like a cold blade. In that moment, a profound realization settled over me. The night I had envisioned as an exciting adventure was spiraling into a disorienting nightmare. As the security guard pulled him by the arm, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. His struggle hinted at something darker beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite grasp. Determined to end the night before it unraveled further, I steeled myself and followed them toward the casino's exit. The flashing neon lights above cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the pavement, distorting reality with each step. The cacophony of the slot machines began to fade as we moved away, but an oppressive silence settled, thick with unspoken tension. Stepping onto the lit sidewalk, the cool night air of Las Vegas felt like a balm, momentarily soothing my rattled nerves. The intense glow of the Strip's lights reflected in my eyes, blurring my vision as I tried to process the night's unsettling events. My companion, now accompanied by the security guard, continued muttering something inaudible, his presence a lingering threat that kept me on edge. Deciding to distance myself from the chaos, I walked slowly along the sidewalk, the residual warmth of the night offering little comfort. My thoughts raced, replaying every misleading smile and every shadow that seemed to follow me. That night, which had promised excitement and new connections, had instead served as a stark reminder of how quickly things can unravel in the blink of an eye. As I continued down the illuminated sidewalk, my nerves frayed, and I took deep, shaky breaths to steady myself. Seeking distraction, I observed the myriad of people around me, each lost in their own nocturnal adventures, their faces masks of joy and indifference. Without warning, my shoe caught in a hidden hole in the sidewalk, sending me stumbling forward. My heart lurched as I nearly fell, the brief moment of vulnerability making me laugh nervously at my own clumsiness. It was an awkward, humiliating incident, but it slightly eased the knot of anxiety coiled tightly in my stomach. Determined to find some semblance of peace, I stumbled upon a small 24-hour cafe and decided to sit down for a coffee. The cozy environment and the soft glow from the lamps offered a stark contrast to the harsh, chaotic energy outside. As I sipped my drink, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee filled my senses, grounding me amidst the surreal night. I reflected on how that evening had morphed from anticipation to discomfort, and finally, to an uneasy resignation. Despite the unsettling encounters, I acknowledged the valuable lesson learned about the deceptive nature of first impressions and the unpredictability of casual encounters. Sitting alone in the cafe, the warmth enveloping me, I began to reminisce about every detail of that bizarre night. The roller coaster of emotions, from initial excitement to creeping unease, and finally the awkward comedy, felt almost dreamlike. Watching the patrons around me, I realized how each person was immersed in their own stories, their own hidden fears and desires, much like me. Despite the night's disarray, I refused to let it tarnish the magic of my Las Vegas adventure. After all, the city was built on surprises and unexpected twists, a trait that, while unsettling, was undeniably part of its allure. Standing up from the cafe, I felt a renewed determination to transform that tumultuous night into a distant, albeit vivid memory. A smile played on my lips as I walked back to my hotel, the bright lights and vibrant energy of the Strip pulsating around me. The disastrous encounter had taught me to tread more carefully, but also to find humor in life's unpredictable moments. As I reflected on the night's events, I understood that Las Vegas was a city where the unexpected was the only certainty. And perhaps in that unpredictability lay its true charm.